All right. What just happened? Okay. There are two things we're doing today. We're not doing a quiz as we said.
We're not?
I wasn't going to intentionally deceive you, but we will have a quiz next week. In the interest of time.
Something else or the same thing? Cumulative.
This and something else. It'll be a little bit more next week. So you're building. Just like any language, you build. What we're going to do today are twofold, two things. I'm going to do a little bit of show and tell. I'm going to show you a few things that I promised you I was going to show you last week, or the week before even. But I'll show to you today a few slides to give you an idea of why we're doing what we do, or the people that have a certain fidelity, a certain love for the language, the sorts of things they look at, the sorts of things they do, the sorts of things they know, the sorts of things they study. And then we'll start a little bit of lesson 2, which is in your hands now. We will not cover all of lesson 2 today. We're taking a little bit at a time. Okay. So what do we do? So the intent of the slides, I only have a few slides, I won't take that long, is to give us a little bit of an overview of the language, how the language developed. I'm not going to get into too many technical things at all, actually. It's just a few interesting slides that you'll get to look at. Okay. We mentioned this during our first class 2 weeks ago. What is Coptic? Coptic is the latest and the last stage of what was the indigenous or the native language of Egypt. What we're familiar with is hieroglyphics, called Ancient Egyptian or Middle Egyptian, depending on what stage of that part of the language was in. But then there's a couple of other stages as well. Hieroglyphics was the first, then there's 2 other stages, and I'll show you what those look like in a minute. Hieratic and Demotic. By the time that the language came into Demotic, it was basically used by the pagan priests of Egypt exclusively, or so we think. Because this is the only evidence we have are in pagan temples where we see some evidence of the language. Coptic itself was used from roughly 300 or maybe around 250 AD. Remember I told you that the reason we have the language was because we needed to translate the New Testament from Greek into Coptic for native Egyptian converts. And we didn't have an alphabet yet, which I'll get to in a minute. So they developed an alphabet around 250 to 300 AD. And the language was more or less used into the 9th century. After which point in time it mostly was lost as a spoken language. It was still used as a literary language to write for a couple hundred years longer. And then it more or less died as a language to be used outside of liturgical practice, in terms outside of the church. Coptic, Egyptian languages generally, are treated as their own language group. So for instance, there's Semitic languages, Arabic, Syriac, Hebrew, Aramaic. Egyptian language, including Coptic, it's its own separate group. This is what hieroglyphics looks like, of course, familiar to all of us as Egyptians, especially if you've visited the country or lived in the country. This is what hieratic looks like. So if you see the difference, you went from pictorial notations to something that's a little more symbolic but very complex, much harder to use. And increasingly less and less people are using it. They were speaking the language but not writing it necessarily. And here's Demotic. Even more simplified in terms of pictorially speaking, more complex, not that much that you can do with it. And so began the obvious need to use an alphabet. And Coptic is the first stage, obviously then, the 4th stage of the language, and the first one, where a notation based on an alphabet was used. And what alphabet are we using? Greek. The Greek alphabet, with 6 additional letters that convey native Egyptian sounds. Likely, like I said, in the 3rd century, and likely needed because of the spread of Christianity outside of Alexandria and into the countryside, the Delta, and then further south. Let's go over dialects really quickly. We use Fuharic in church now, Behiri, which was used primarily in the Nile Delta, northern Egypt. what we use in church now. But the most widely used dialect when Coptic was used is actually Sahidic, Saidi. And it was used throughout most of Egypt, in fact. And it was the one that was used primarily to produce literature, to translate the New Testament from Greek to Coptic. And we have examples, many, of course, there are thousands of pages, manuscripts, and I'll show you a few examples now, of what Sahidic looked like, okay? And the reason we do is because the book itself, what's called the Codex, was actually invented in Egypt. The idea of a book, centuries before the Gutenberg press, was invented in Egypt. And this is how we have so many examples of manuscripts, I'll show you what they look like, that are in Sahidic. A couple of other dialects, Fayumic, Akhmimic, really dependent on the region that I came from. This is an example, if you can see it, of what an ancient book looked like. This is actually a book of Psalms, written on leather, parchment. And this is from the 4th century. So very, very early. This is actually, unfortunately, this is a bad image in terms of quality, because this is a scan of a photocopy of a photograph of what was originally a page in leather. And it's actually about this size. Okay? This is in the Louvre in Paris now. And this contains a homily by Shunuti, the 5th century abbot of the White Monastery in Upper Egypt. And actually, this is one of the pages that I had to study for my dissertation, for my PhD. What's interesting about this is these things here. So this is leather. This is animal leather. These are actually holes